Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and in this video I want to show you how to truncate silence in Reaper. That's not only to remove parts that are silent, but actually to squish that time frame in which no one is speaking. That is useful if you have some form of long interview or you're editing videos, like tutorials like these, or maybe a podcast, and you want to remove all the silence. And that works for audio and also for video if you have some kind of visual roundtable thing or a podcast with a video as well for YouTube and whatever. And if you have watched some of my previous videos, I have addressed this before using a technique that was kind of a hack. I was rendering another track just with all the voices combined to do some cutting. And since then, I developed a custom action to kind of automate this hack. But now I have a definitive solution. I wrote some rescripts that are solving the problem for real without having to render an extra track that's just a hack. And this solution comes in 4 different flavors, and I want to show you right now. So let's jump right in. Here I have this project with 2 people, but in general, this works with as many microphones as you would like. And sometimes no one's speaking. For instance, in this period here, no one's speaking. So I don't want only to remove these parts where there is silence in one of the tracks. And if I wanted to do that, then I could use something like a dynamic split. And I could remove all the parts that are silent, like so. But I actually want to remove all this space in between, effectively taking these items and moving them closer together, like so. Okay, so I have a custom rescript that does this, and it comes in 4 different flavors, as I said. I'm going to show you first my favorite, and I think that's the one most people are going to want to use. It is called Prepare Selected Items for Editing. And you just run this script. It is going to normalize all the tracks so that they are about the same level. Then it's going to show you this window where you can set different parameters for what you consider to be silence and even how long a period needs to be considered silence and how long some spoken part of the track needs to be loud enough to count for that long. And then you can have some pads if you don't want to cut right when someone's speaking, but you want to preserve some time between the speakers, or even just allow someone to breathe in the middle of their talk. If you're removing silences from a single person speaking, you don't want to cut all the breaths. So you can leave some pads here. And I like these settings here, and you can play around with dynamic split because the settings are similar. So if you play around with dynamic split, you're going to find the ones that work for you. You can start with these values. That's what works for me. And I like to have the pads adding up to the amount of silence that I am going to allow you. So if you have a silence that is shorter than 300 milliseconds, it's going to be ignored. And I'm leaving pads of 100 milliseconds on each side of an item so that the silences are always 300 milliseconds, which I think is a good natural breath. It's how long people take, or at least that's how much I'm going to allow my speakers to breathe for. And then you want to make sure that you are splitting and removing silent areas and that you are preserving the timing of non-silent areas. If you don't enable this option, then Reaper will smoosh everything together, but it will do that on a per track basis. So your timing between different microphones will be all messed up. And then these other options I disable. I don't need to run the effects to do the detection. I just hit process, and then you can see that it's not only removing the silence, but it's also squishing everything together. And it's also putting here, as I zoom in, you will be able to see, it's putting a crossfade, because sometimes a silence is not complete silence, and you may hear a click if there is a sample that is just a little bit louder than complete silence, and then you switch to a different item and you hear a small click. Crossfade gets rid of that. So that is a custom action. It's actually a rescript that does all this truncation of silence without having to do the trick I did before with a separate track that rendered all the different microphones. This is faster, it is more robust, and it is simpler to set up. I'm going to show you later how to install all these things. But before I do, I want to show you the different flavors. So if I'm going to undo the thing I just did, if you want to get rid not only of this, the moments of silence, so for instance, in this case, you don't want to only get rid of this part, but you also want to remove all the periods of silence in all the different tracks. And that may make things simpler for you when you're editing. It's kind of a matter of taste. And I don't really like to have this because you sometimes can hear the tracks coming in and out. So I like my timeline to look like the thing I showed you before, blocks of all the microphones open. And of course, if you want to make things sane in terms of silence and not necessarily hearing some breathing that someone is doing while they're not speaking, of course, you can always set up the auto mixer. And if you want to learn more about this, definitely watch the other videos on this channel. And I would say that with the auto mixer, plus the scripts we are doing now, you can pretty much just drop in some microphones into Reaper and use these two things, the auto mixer and the truncation of silence that I'm showing in this video, and you pretty much have done 90% of the work of editing a long-form podcast or interview, or a video even. You can use this for something like a vlog with jump cuts. It works really well. And also there is the auto mixer for video if you have multiple cameras pointing at different people. Anyway, go watch that other video. For now, I want to show you the other flavor that you may want to use with the auto mixer, you may want to use without the auto mixer, but in any case, it is truncate, silence, and trim. And of course, for all these actions, you have to select some items. So let's do that, run. Same options as before. This is actually something that comes with Reaper. It looks like the dynamic split thing. It is a feature that comes with Reaper, the auto trim split items. And my rescript depends on this thing that comes with Reaper. So anyway, process. And now we did the same thing. We removed periods of silence and we squished everything together, but we also removed periods of silence when the other person is speaking. And some people may prefer it this way. It's as if you had a gate on each track that is completely taking off that microphone when the person is not speaking or the person is doing noises below a certain threshold. So that's another flavor. You may like this, you may not. I don't. I prefer the other way, but it's there. It's another option for you. You can install this script as well. The next option is this one. So this one is not going to do the normalization of the sound. So I'll return. Yeah. So before, that's the pure recording without normalization of levels. And if you don't want to do normalization of levels and you don't want to do crossfades, so remember that in the first action I showed you, it was doing normalization. It was also doing the crossfades. If you don't want any of that, then I have truncate silence in selected items, and I just run this. And now I probably need a threshold that is lower, and maybe something like -40 will do. Let's see. So I process this. Now it's doing the same as before. It's not doing any normalization. And this other one is also not doing any normalization or crossfades. So you can zoom in, no crossfades there. And then for the fourth and final action, it's actually the lower level thing that all the other actions depend on. And that is, suppose that for whatever reason, you have already done the auto trim. So this is the thing that comes with Reaper. So suppose that you have already done this, or maybe you have done normalization. I like to do this. And then you already did the removal of the sound. So you are at this point. And all you want to do is just smoosh the items together. So if you want to do that, then you can select the items and look for reposition. Yeah, so this one, remove gaps between selected items, reposition selected items across tracks. I gave it this name as well because it's similar to the reposition selected items that come with SWS. And it's also similar to the effect that recently was added into Reaper. That is, if you have ripple editing on all tracks enabled and you use dynamic split, You can also do this on a per track basis. So this is going to do that. The reposition items is going to do that per track. So I'll select all of them and run reposition items so you can see what's happening here. So if I say that I want to add an interval of 0 seconds at the end, it's going to smoosh everything together, but per track. So the timing, the relative timing between the tracks is lost. But with this one that I created, you can run this and it preserves the relative timing. It's just smooshing together the items and removing the dead air. Okay, so this is great and you want to use this. How do you install it? Well, you go to the description below where you're going to find this URL. You copy this, that is the repack URL, and you have to have installed Reaper and repack and SWS. And if you don't know how to do that, then you can search on YouTube. There are several videos. There is a very good one by the Reaper blog explaining how to do the installation of all the things you need to work with Reaper. Once you have repack installed, come to extensions, repack, import repositories, paste in the URL. You copy it from the GitHub website I linked below. Make sure you install all the packages that are in the default repositories for repack. So all these ones that come with Reaper, with repack. Also install SWS and install the things, all the packages from the repository linked below, and you will be good to go. You'll have all these actions. You can assign them to custom shortcuts. You can put them on your menu bar. You can put them here on the menu. All the things you can do with actions. That's how you install these 4 different actions to truncate silence. Now there are some fine points that I want to make that have to do with how everything else in the project responds to these edits. So here I have again the two tracks with some moments of silence. And I have here a MIDI item, but this could be other audio tracks. This could be a video item. So maybe you have all your microphones here and all your cameras below. So if you just select the things here and you do the deletion, the preparing the project for prepare selected items for editing, if you run this action, then all the other items in the project will be cut as well. So if you have some video synchronized with the microphones, the video track, the items here will be cut and smushed together as well. So to keep everything in sync. And markers that are, or even I think project regions that are in spaces where there is silence, for instance, this one, they will go away. And all the markers that are after or in positions where there is some sound, they will stay there, but they will be moved along with everything else. So they will ripple. So let's try this and you can see that, yeah, so one of the markers went away because it was the marker that was in a moment of silence. And you can see that the other tracks were cut as well. So if you have video here, it will be in sync. It will continue to be in sync. The other markers were moved accordingly. Now, this behavior here of cutting everything else may be good or bad. If you have video that is synchronized with the microphones, then that's good. And that's why I designed it this way. But it may be bad if you have a sound bed, some soundtrack that should be consistent and continuous along the whole thing. Then you would be cutting your soundtrack when there is silence, and that's not the intent. So in that case, what you may want to do is just drop in that track later. After having cut the microphones, you drop in the audio below. Or you may want to do it this way and then just remove all the items here and all the items from here. Make sure you don't have repo editing enabled. And then you can just drag and you will be able to recreate that track. It's a minor annoyance, but I think it behaves nicely with most things you would want to cut, like video along with audio. And those are the 4 different actions that I am releasing today. If you are only interested in using them, then you are all set. You can stop watching the video right now because I showed you everything I created. But if you're interested in learning how these things work, then I'm going to review the code for all these 4 different actions and go through the re-script and show you everything that's going on there so you can learn how it works and also learn some Lua and re-scripts. So let's jump right in. I think that the best one to begin with is the one that works as the basis for everything else. So reposition, remove gaps, between selected items. Let's go to edit this action. So this is the code that is actually doing the work. And you can see that it's not a lot of code. It is relatively simple. And it just took me a while to write this because I was still learning Reaper. So when I first did my first video about truncating silence, I was just finding the simplest thing that could work. But now that I learned some more rescripts, it's not that hard to write this script. Anyway, so what's happening here is, first, I'm checking the number of selected items, because if you have not selected any items, for instance, now I have unselected everything, and I try to run the action, you can see that it runs into an error. And I would like to communicate that to the user. So I first check if the number of selected items is equal to 0. How did I find this? Well, I went through the API and I looked for things that have to do with selected. So I searched for selected, and eventually I found what I was looking for. You can also Google around, and the forum is okay for finding these kinds of things. And I have to pass 0 here because I'm talking about the current project, the one that I have open. So if I have multiple projects open, I am talking about this one. And you could have items selected in different projects. Anyway, so if the number of selected items is 0, then I'm going to first show a message to the user. And I recently learned that MB stands for message box. Can you believe that? No, so show message to user. No, it's MB for message box. And of course, there is a magic number here because that's how the API works in Reaper. So this magic number is to say that I want that box to have a single button that reads OK. And you have other numbers so that you can show buttons like yes or no or retry and that sort of thing. But not only am I showing the message to the user, I'm also returning. And you can see that I'm not in a function call here. So why am I returning? Well, because when you return on the top level of a Lua program, what you're actually doing is stopping execution entirely. So nothing else is going to run. And that's exactly what I want. If you run into an error, I don't want the rest of the script to actually run. So that's what's happening there. Then I have to do a setup to enable undoing the whole thing I'm going to do in one pass. If you don't do this with the begin block and end block by the end of the action, then all the parts of the action here will register as one thing in your history. So you can see the undo history here. And I have things like truncate silence in selected items, which is one of the actions we are looking at. This registers as one entry in the undo history. So if the user runs your action and then hits Command Z or Control Z on a PC, then it will undo your whole thing, your whole action. If you don't have these things, then it may be the case that the user will be undoing all the actions one at a time. So in this case, it would be removing one silence at a time. And in some cases, under some circumstances, you may get away without having the end block here or the matching begin block there, because Reaper will try to create an undo point for you. And in some cases, it gets that right, but in this case, it does not. Because I'm using something here that does a command, it's like coming to the actions menu and running one of these commands. Each one of these will register as one point in the undo history. So if I don't have this here, then it would remove one chunk of silence at a time, and you would have to Command Z a whole lot to get where you started. And also you can see that besides my meaningful name, I'm also passing another magic number, and that one means I am undoing everything that this did. So I am undoing all changes to the project, all changes to tracks and whatnot. And there are some flags that are optimizations that you can pass here if you are doing just one thing. Like suppose that all you're doing is moving an item around. Then you could pass another number here to optimize so that Reaper makes something faster. I don't really know. Anyway, I always use -1 here and it usually works. Then I'm going to collect a bunch of things, 3 things. I'm going to collect all the items that were selected. So if I have like these 4 items, I will collect all of them into this set. This is going to be a set in Lua. currently it's an empty set, but I'm going to go through a loop and I'm going to collect all the items. Because remember, the strategy here is I am trying to reposition all the items across tracks. So this is the core action of my task. So I'm going to actually come here and maybe go to this version. Yes, I'll go to this version and make a copy. And I'm going to run a truncate silence here real quick. So I'll run a dynamic split, whatever. It amounts to the same. And now we have a bunch of items to work with that are separate, like so. So these items will all be collected here eventually into this set. And I'm also collecting the start and stop points. And I wish I could call this the end point, because start and end kind of makes sense. But I have to call this start and stop because in Lua, end is a keyword. Anyway, so I'm also collecting the start point and end point. So this is the start point and this is the end point of all the items together. This is the range in which my truncate silence will have to work. So I want this to start, I want the minimum to start with a really big value, and I want the maximum to start with a really small value. And in Lua math huge, it represents infinity, the maximum number you can represent. So this is a big value, and minus infinity, a very small value. And of course, later we are going to take the minimum between the current value and the one we just got. And that's going to bring infinity down to this point here. So we are going to start at infinity way here to the right and come back to the left until we get the minimum of all the start points for all the items that were selected. Anyway, let's get to the loop. So in the loop, we are going to do a setup here to loop through all the indices for the selected items. And here again, I'm having to call a function with that magic number of 0 for the current project. And I want to loop from 0 up to the number of selected items minus 1, which is the index of the last item. The index of the last item is the number of items minus 1, because it starts with 0. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there are 7 items here. So 6 is 7 minus 1. And now that I have the index for the item, I have to actually grab the item. So again, 0 for the current project. This is the index of the selected media item. And then I get properties from this item. The properties are read with this function that takes a special argument here. There are several different parameters on an item, like all these things that you can see here, probably more things even than you can see there. And you can go to the API help and look for this function. You will see the list of all the things you can query from the item. I'm querying the position, and that's where it starts. For instance, here, and the position is this number. And I'm also querying the length, but I'm adding the start position to the length. So effectively what I'm doing is computing the start and the stop or end positions of all the items. And then I am doing this. What's happening here is I have my set of items. And what I care about in the items is not really the item itself. I don't really care about the item itself. I'm not going to do anything with the item. What I do care is just the start and stop points that I computed. So that's what I'm going to store in this items set. As I said, this is a table in Lua, and a table can be used as a list. We are going to use a table as a list down here. A table can be used as a map of values, and a table can also be used as a set. This time I'm using a table as a set of values. And that's because I don't really care about the order of the items in this data structure. I just care about accumulating all the items, but I don't really care about which comes first. So I'm going to use the table as a set. And in this case, to do this, what I'm doing is I'm putting what I care about from the item, the start and stop points, as a table. So this is the part that is selected is a table that has these two fields. So in this case, this table is representing a map or an object. You can think of things like JavaScript objects or C structs or maybe even Java objects if you want. That's the parallels that I guess I can trace. So this is creating an object or a table that contains everything I care about from the item. And in particular, it's interesting to note that I'm not storing the item itself. I'm not going to need it. But then I'm doing that, and I'm going to put that table as a key on the items table. So keys are unique in tables. And by doing this, by putting the table on the key, because keys are unique, this is effectively working as a set. And of course, I have to give it some value because it's still a table. So the value I'm giving is just true. It could be the number 1, it could be the number 0, it could be an empty string, it could be different values for different things. It doesn't really matter. I'm not actually using the value, I'm only using the keys. So I'm going to traverse through the keys later, as you will see. And that's how you work with a table to represent a set in Lua. And then I'm also accumulating here the minimum start and the maximum stop. So I'm taking the minimum between the current minimum start and the maximum between the maximum stop and the start and stop points I just collected. What this is doing is, of course, it's starting at infinity and then it's moving back. So it's taking the minimum between the start of, let's say that we have all these items selected and you are considering this one. So the cursor will move from infinity to here. And then when you're considering this item, it will move from this position to here because that's the minimum between the two. And then when it's considering this item, it's going to move from this position to, well, it's going to remain here actually, because the minimum between the start of this item and that one is this one, and so on and so forth. And the same for the stop on the right as well. It starts at minus infinity and goes to the right until it finds this spot. So now minimum start and maximum stop represent this range, right? Next, the loop is over. We are going to start another loop. The intent of this loop is we have this range, and initially, to begin with, we are going to consider that the whole range is one big wide gap that we will remove. Okay, so that's the gap that we start with. But now we are going to take each item and we are going to slice this gap so that each item here will be considered in turn, so that this gap will now be, for instance, consider this one. Okay, so we started with this big gap and now we are going to consider this item. So this item is going to slice this gap into two gaps. One gap that starts here until there, the start of the item we are considering. So one gap will look like this. The other gap will look like that. And then we loop again. And for each one of the gaps, now we have two gaps, one here, one there. Now for each one of these gaps, we will consider the next item. So this item, for instance, will not interact with this gap. This gap will remain as it is. But this other gap will be sliced by this into two gaps, one that goes from here to there, and another one goes from here to there. And then we'll consider this item that will not interact with this gap, and it will not interact with this gap, but it will interact with this one, and it will slice it up so that it's only taking this much. So when you are done working through all the items, we are going to iterate over all the items. What you end up with is just a list of gaps. And then you can go ahead and remove the gap. So by the end, we'll have a gap here and we'll have a gap there. And then we'll remove those two gaps. So that's the strategy we are going to use here. So to begin with, the gaps is going to be a list of gaps, right? We have multiple gaps eventually, but it starts with only one gap. So these outer brackets, they are a list. We are going to have a list of gaps. That's why the variable name is plural. But the element, so each element in the list is one of these maps of start and stop points. And you can see that it's similar to the start and stop points that we represented here. So we're using these tables with start and stop fields as a way to represent a range. And it begins with the whole range we have computed with minimum start and maximum stop. Now we are going to go over every item. As I said, items are keys on our table of items because the items are a set. I don't care about in which order I'm traversing the items. So I'm just looking at the keys with the pairs function, and that's going to return me the keys and also the values. So I could look at the values and they would always be true. And I could do that, but it doesn't matter. So I'm not doing. I'm just writing it like this. And then I'm going to initialize a list of new gaps. And of course, by the end, I'm going to say that the gaps are equal to the new gaps. So I'm going to do the slicing here and the slicing of each one of the gaps. So we'll have to consider each one of the gaps in turn. And this time, order matters. I want this to be ordered. And so I'm using I pairs for in order pairs of the gaps. And then for each gap, I don't care about the key in this case, okay? So the key is going to be, for instance, this one is key number 1, and then the next one will be key number 2 and 3 and so on, because it's a list. But I don't care about the keys. I only care about the gaps. So I'm putting underscore here as I don't care, and then gap is the actual start and end points. And then for each gap, I'm going to slice it in 2. And the slices are, well, this one and that one. This slice is, I guess the best way to work this out is, suppose that we have, for instance, the first time around, we have a gap that looks like this. So this item is our gap with minimum start here on the left and maximum stop here on the right. And then I'm going to take these gaps that I'm going to add are, first, it starts, and we are also considering this item at this point, okay? So this is the gap that we are considering, and this is the item that we are considering. Now let's think about what's going to happen here. So this first one, it starts at the maximum between the gap start and the item stop. So the gap start is over here, and the item stop is over there. The maximum between the two is here. So we are going to start there, right where the cursor is. And we are going to stop at the gap stop. So what we are doing is just taking this part. I don't want that to be that item. Okay. So I'm only taking this part. So this is the result of this part. And then the line right below it is, well, it starts at the gap start, so it starts here, and it ends at the minimum between the gap stop and the item start. So the item starts here, that's your item start, and the gap stops here, that's your gap stop. The minimum between the two is this, right here, the item start. So this will be the result of that. As you can see, it took the original gap and sliced it in two, the left and the right ones. And then it's doing this add gap function. It's calling the gaps. It's calling a function with the gaps, the add gap. And add gap is going to check if the gap start is before the gap stop. Because in some cases, you may have a gap that interacts, for instance, with this. Suppose that you are now considering this gap and this item, okay? So you're considering this gap and this item. Let's see what happens in this case. I will move this track up and delete these. So I'm considering these two. Now the gap start, so the new gap start is the maximum between the gap start, so the maximum between this and the item stop. The maximum between these two is this position here. And it will stop at gap stop. So you're trying to create an item that starts here and ends there. That doesn't really make sense. It's a gap that should end before it even started. It doesn't really make sense. So I don't want to actually add this gap. It's nonsensical to add this gap. So that's why I check. Do I have a gap start that is less than the gap stop? If so, then actually insert a new gap into the table or list of new gaps. And that's why I have the add gap function here, because I want to do this check every time. And I could do this check by assigning this to a local variable maybe. So maybe you could do it like this. You could local new gap equals to that, and then if new gap start is less than new gap stop, then table insert with new gap. You could do it like this, but then you would have to repeat yourself for the other gap, this one. So I thought it would be better to just have that auxiliary function add gap to do this check for us. Okay. Okay, so that's where we started. Anyway, when you're done doing that, you will end up with only the gaps that you want. You will end up with only gaps here and there. After you have considered everything, as long as you are doing the checks here, you will end up with only these two gaps. Okay, now that you have done that, notice something really important, and that is the order in which these gaps are being added to the list. We did this exercise before, and we ended up with two gaps. When we considered this, we started with a gap that looked like this, and then we sliced it using this item. We ended up with an item on the right and one on the left. The one on the right was added first. Remember that? That is important, because by the end, we will have gaps from right to left. So if by the end the gaps will be these two, it's important that this one is first on the list of gaps. The list of gaps is actually reversed chronologically. It's going from right to left chronologically. That is a big deal, and that has been designed this way carefully. So if you invert these two lines, the algorithm doesn't work. It's important that these two lines are in this order because the gaps should be from right to left. And why is that? Well, because the next part is going to take these gaps that currently are just a table. It's just a table. It doesn't do anything yet. We will actually go into Reaper and slice those periods of time. Okay? So the way we are going to do that is going to go through each gap, similar to what we did here. So same line, actually. We are going to traverse the list of gaps in order. We are taking the values because we don't care about the keys. In this case, it's a list. So the keys are going to be 1, 2, 3, and so on. And then we are going to set the loop time range. So this is equivalent to just literally dragging over here in Reaper. And we have to pass a bunch of parameters here. I don't even remember all of them. So the first one is this setting or getting? Because this function is used to get and set the time range. In this case, I want to set, so I'm passing through. Is this a loop? Well, not really. It's not a loop. It's just a time range. And then I'm passing the start and stop points. And then there is another Boolean here for, I don't even know because I cannot read it. Maybe if I do that. Yeah, allow auto seek. I don't even know what that is for. So I'm passing false. So I'm doing this so that I am actually selecting this gap. I'm selecting that as a range. And when I do that, I run a Reaper command that does time selection, remove contents of time selection, moving later items. So I'm running this command. It's similar to what would happen if I literally just dragged my mouse here and created this region and then came here to the actions menu and ran the action, which is called time selection, remove contents. So let's see, time selection, move contents. Yeah, so if I just literally ran this, you can see the command ID 4C21. That is the command ID I'm using here. So I'm literally just coming here and clicking this button and running that. So that's how this chunk of time gets removed from the timeline. And I'm doing that for all the gaps. Why is this important? Why do you have to do from right to left? Why am I making such a big case of having the gaps from right to left? Well, that's because when you do one of these, you just moved everything. So now all the timestamps change. So your start and stop points here would change as well. If I did this on the left first, so if I came here and selected this gap and ran my action, then this time code would have changed and my gap would be offset. So instead, because I'm doing from right to left, I am always going from, okay, every timestamp on the right changed, but all the ones on the left are still valid. If I go from right to left, then I will remove all the chunks and they will do the right thing. Okay, that's it. That's the core of the algorithm. That is what's doing the bulk of the work. Now let's look at all the other 3 actions to see how they're using this one to accomplish what they do somewhat differently. So the next one we are going to look at is truncate items, truncate silence in selected items. So let's edit this one so we can look at its code. And if you don't remember this one, okay, I'll select everything, delete, copy these 2 over so we can begin again with a fresh start. So what this one is doing is it's similar to the one we just did that is mushing the items, but it's calling auto trim split items before. So let's use this one. And to use this, I have selected the items. I can just click here on start, or I can hit Command S to save. I'll hit start. So what this one is doing is it's smushing all the items together. This action is super similar to the previous one, just a couple changes. First, I am calling auto trim split items remove silence, right? And you can see that interface popping up when I run the action. Auto trim split items, there you go. And then I am splitting the items, so let's do this by hand. So I'm doing auto trim remove silence, run, process. So I'm at this point. And at this point, I have all the items chopped. So I will close this one so we don't get confused. So now I can do the thing we just learned how to do, and that is to collect all the items, find the minimum and the maximum gap, do the gap slicing thing. So we are doing all the gaps collection calculation. By the end, we'll have that table that has all the ranges we want to remove. And on the other action, we would go ahead and remove them, but this time we are not. We are doing some other shenanigans first. And that is, we are ending that undo block. Remember the undo block I told you about that consolidates all the undo points in the undo history? Well, now we are going to use this to our advantage because we can undo. And we are back in this situation. So we computed all the gaps, but we undid the truncation. So we undid the auto trim split items, remove silence, but we still have the gaps variable with the gaps we want to remove. But we restored the items because we want those moments of silence when someone else is speaking, which is a good thing to have if you are using the auto mixer. Anyway, so we close the undo block and actually hit undo. It's as if you hit Command Z right now. And you end up where you started, but you have all the gaps. So then you can begin another block and actually go and do the slicing. And that's how this works. So this is very similar to the one we just saw. The main differences are, first, we are calling auto trim split items first, but more importantly, you are hitting Command Z in the middle of the action right here. So this is what you end up with. You run the thing, and for a while, I guess, on the screen, you can see that it actually put some spaces in between while it was computing the gaps, and then it actually restored everything and cut just the silences, leaving the silences on the other tracks when someone else is speaking. And there are ways in ReScript for you to prevent that flash of things moving around on the screen, but I decided to actually leave that to make the code simpler, to make the intent more obvious for the user even, because the user can actually see everything being smushed together, which is kind of nice. Anyway, I kind of prefer it this way. There are ways to prevent this though. You can prevent the UI refresh. Anyway, that is the truncate silence in selected items. Next, let's look at the one that looks just like it. So truncate silence in selected items and trim. So I will close the other action and I will edit this one. So this one is doing something similar. So I will come back. This is the original. These are the original items. And I will run this action. So it's similar to the previous one. The difference is that it's actually not keeping the moments of silence when someone else is speaking. So you end up with all these chopped blocks in your timeline. This is similar to the previous one, but it works differently. The code for it is different. Because this time we can rely on other existing rescripts. So these are the existing rescripts we're going to use. We are going to use auto trim split items, remove silence, and we are going to use the one that does the remove of gaps between selected items. The first rescript we look at in the code. And why couldn't I use something similar to this strategy when doing the one we just looked at here? So let's see. This is the one we were looking at before, the one that keeps silences when someone is speaking. Why couldn't I use a similar approach and just reuse some of the existing tasks? Well, it's because of this part, right? Because of this trick of undoing in the middle of the action. There is no way for me to jump into the middle of an action and change the way it's behaving. So I couldn't really reuse the remove gaps between selected items. I couldn't just call it. I had to copy and paste the code and actually change it around. But on this one, what we are doing is effectively what you could do with a custom action in Reaper by sequencing two different actions. I'm actually just calling auto trim split items and then calling this other script. So now let's see how this is working. First off, I have the begin and end block. And then I define this function called run. It takes as arguments the name of the action and its ID. Why do I have this separate thing? Well, it is because you may not have this action installed. If for some reason you installed truncate silence in selected items and trim, but you did not install remove gaps between selected items, reposition selected items across tracks, if you have installed one but not the other, then you would try to run this script and it would fail. So I want to alert the user and explain everything that's going on, and I extracted that verification into its local function, its own a separate function. It takes the description and identifier. The description is just for the benefit of the error message, but more importantly, because when reading the code, I like to see the thing that I am running. You can see that in other actions, when I'm running some external code, I am always running external actions that come with Reaper. So there is no way you could have that action missing. It comes with Reaper. And its identifier is just a number. And then I put a comment here with the name of the action I'm running. And that's for the benefit of the reader. Well, now that I'm extracting this notion of running an action into its own function, I am making the user pass, or making myself really, pass the name of the action here as an argument, and that serves as the comment. That is a documentation of the action that is running. I also show that in the error message. And then I have to check what kind of identifier do I have. If I am running an action that comes with Reaper, like this one, then this is a number. But if I'm running a third-party action like my own action, the remove gaps between selected items, reposition selected items across tracks, then that identifier is a long string. And that is what I check here. If the identifier is a number, then my identifier number is the number. But otherwise, I need to use this Reaper function to actually grab the number that represents this action. And now I'm going to check. Did I actually get a number that I can use? Because if this command tried to look for a name, this name, which I actually, by the way, grabbed from here, okay? So this command, if you don't see this, you can right-click and tell Reaper to show action IDs. And when you're on top of any action, you can right-click and copy the command ID. That's how I got it. And of course, not from this one, but I actually got it from the one that we are using. Anyway, so here in this point, I just pasted that ID. If this function tried to look that ID up to give us back the ID number and it failed, then it returns 0. So I'm checking, did I get 0 back? If I did, then I'm going to error in a very strong way, because this should never happen, okay? If you installed everything in the way that I explained, this will never happen. It will never trigger. You will have all the actions, you will have installed this as well, you will be good to go. But if this fails, then I'm going to error using the error function from Lua. This stops execution of the script right then and there. And in Reaper, and of course that depends on the application that is using Lua, but in Reaper, that shows up in the screen, very clear message. So to test that, I can error with hello and run this code. Oh, it actually didn't do anything. Isn't that great? Oh, okay, so it showed right here. But if I run, okay, now it did the thing. Yeah, so it shows an error message as well. So the user will always see this if something comes up. And then this error message is explaining, oh, this script you need, for this script to work, you need to install SWS and all the packages from Repack. And if you already did this, then this is a bug. And I'm saying what the user should do, which is to report this to the repository or to my email address in case they don't have a GitHub account. In any way, this is something that the user should never see, but if an error comes up, this will show that error to the user, and it will also stop the execution of the script. Previously, in other cases, when I wanted to stop the execution of the script, it was not so drastic because it was not such a bad error like this one. So I could just use return. Also, we were on the top level, so we were checking, for instance, here the number of selected items. And if you have not selected any items, then I would show the message to the user using this, and then use return to stop execution of the script. In this case, this would not work because return would just return from our run function. So instead, I'm using error that stops execution even if you are in the middle of running a function. And then if everything works, I will actually run the command using this, which is the Reaper way of running a command. And this flag, I think it is the current project, but in the documentation, it just says flag, and everywhere you see people use this, they pass 0 as the flag. I have no idea what the flag even is. I don't think it's documented. Fun stuff. And now, leaving the best for last, let's look at the prepare selected items for editing, which is, I think, the best one of the 4. That's the one I showed you first in the demonstration because I think that's the one that everyone should use. In structure, it is very similar to the one we just looked at. It has this function to allow you to run custom actions, custom rescripts that were installed by Repack, and also SWS actions, whatever is not by default in Reaper, and it will warn the user if something went wrong. So the same function as before, copy and paste it, but this one, it's running. Normalize loudness from SWS. It is running the script that does truncation of silence, but keeps the silent areas when someone else is speaking for a better noise floor when you're using the auto mixer. And then it's running this SWS action that adds crossfades between adjacent items to add that little crossfade between items. So yeah, it's same strategy, super simple. In effect, this is kind of like a custom action in disguise. But there is an important trick here. You can see that it's not using begin and end blocks for undo. And that's actually kind of undesirable because if you run this action, you end up with 3 different undo points. Unfortunately, that's a limitation of this script because this script does that trick of using an undo point to actually work. Remember, it calls auto trim to trim the spaces of silence, then it collects the gaps, but then it undoes the auto trim to actually keep the silence in the areas when someone else is speaking. So because of that, if I try to run this with begin and end undo blocks here in this whole thing, then in the middle of this action, it would undo up to this point. So if I left the undo at this point right here, unfortunately, it would undo this part as well. Which is, it's kind of okay. We could maybe normalize this again after the action. I don't know, but it would be annoying and we would end up with multiple undo blocks, undo items in the history anyway. So that's kind of a limitation of how this whole hack, I think is a kind of a hack, works. But anyway, I think it's good enough. So that's a small detail here. And that's it for the code review. I actually covered the whole action and the whole 4 rescripts. It's not that much code. It's not that complicated. It accomplishes something really cool that many people have wanted, and many people said they kind of used something like this, but I never saw anything exactly like this published before. And I looked around. I did my research. Anyway, thanks for watching up to this point. I hope you learned something about rescripts. I hope you have some fun writing your own rescripts. It's definitely a lot of fun to accomplish so much with so little code. And I hope you are liking Lua as well. I think it's a wonderful little language. I'm liking it a lot. If you like Reaper and programming and you are interested in audio effects and these kinds of things, then make sure you watch the other videos on this channel, as well as subscribe to watch the videos that are coming up with all sorts of new effects and new tricks in Reaper like this. And of course, code reviews for everything, because I want to share the knowledge with everyone. Anyway, thanks for watching. I see you on the next one. Bye-bye.